Welcome to the Future Print Summit discussion panel on inkjet collaboration. Future Print brought together partners from across the industry representing a cross-section of products that are necessary to build printers from. And today the object of the discussion is to highlight the importance of how us as suppliers and consultants work together in order to get customers to where they expect to be with inkjet technology. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our guests from Sunjet, Ricoh, Integration Technologies and Meteor to introduce themselves in a bit more detail.
My name's Phil Jackman. I work for Sun Chemical. I'm the global product manager there. So I'm influential in the product development and strategy of our digital business. Sun Chemical, as you probably well know, and with its parent company DIC, is the world's largest provider of printing inks and pigments. And I work within our digital division, where we are a global business looking to serve all areas of inkjet ink development and supporting our customers really, whether that's labels, packaging, graphics, industrial applications, a very wide portfolio of products to support the emerging needs of inkjet printing.
Hi, I'm Richard Darling. I'm with Ricoh on the industrial printing side. My focus is on printheads and the use of printheads in applications. Also involved in some strategic projects where Ricoh is developing industrial printing, industrial printers, and large sub-assemblies that go into OEM developments. I've 3 years with Ricoh. Before that, 7 years with Xaar, and originally with Xerox for 10 years. So I've transitioned from Xerox to Ricoh, with a gap in between, which is essential, I think.
My name's Simon Roberts. I'm Managing Director for Integration Technology. I'm also Managing Director for our parent company, IST Met's operation in the UK. My personal background is that I have a long history of opening new markets, sales and business development in global markets, with a specialty really of trying to diversify portfolios of existing products into new market segments. At Integration Technology, 95% of our new equipment sales are LED curing heads. We do still supply some legacy product in mercury lamp, but most of our product now is LED. We've been heavily involved in the digital revolution, and we supply, again, of that 95%, I would suggest 85% of that goes into traditional graphical printing applications. We're now trying to diversify into more industrial applications and collaborate with the people that are on the panel today to see how we can utilise our products in those areas.
Hi, I'm Clive Ayling. I'm the Managing Director of Meteor Inkjet Limited. I've been in the industrial inkjet business since the turn of the century, so that's 20 years now. And the last century, Richard, not the one before. Meteor provides the electronics to drive printheads, much like Richard's, Ricoh, and the software to drive the electronics. And through our affiliated companies, we provide the software to provide the workflow, also to provide the data for that to happen. And we also provide a few tools for the laboratory for evaluating waveforms with inks and that kind of thing. The bulk of Meteor is, in terms of business, is in China or the Far East, Japan and Taiwan, Korea, those places. But my headquarters, apart from my room behind me where I'm working at home at the moment, the headquarters is near Cambridge in the UK, and that's where we do the bulk of our R&D and our product development.
Now to introduce myself. So my name's Mark Bale. I run a small technology consultancy in Industrial Inkjet. And the reason I'm running this panel today is because I'm lucky enough to have products from all parties that are part of the panel today in my lab, pictured behind me. So the subject today is to talk about the importance in collaboration for the successful completion of inkjet projects. And the focus, this being an industrial session, is on the more industrial bespoke uses of inkjet technology, which places quite a lot of demands on suppliers for supporting the machine development. So although we don't have an OEM represented here today, our discussions are really about how we support our customers who are OEMs and work together to make that the easiest journey for them when they have an application they'd like to build a machine for. And it's not really specifically about individual products, but how we make them work together to meet those needs. So first, I think we should really start by defining what we mean by collaboration within our businesses. So Richard, would you mind starting with that?
Yeah, sure. Well, during my time in Industrial Inkjet, I've actually seen some successful and some less successful integrations of inkjet technology. There has been, in the early days, a lot of finger pointing that it's the ink or it's that or it's the other. Over the years, though, there's been increasing collaboration between people. It's between people and their organizations. Sometimes it's actually, regardless of the organizations, it's actually between people. Sometimes it's because the organizations themselves need to collaborate. But we're all in a chain. Sometimes the printhead is considered to be the expensive bit, the technology bit, the first bit to choose, but it's effectively just a delivery vehicle to deliver a fluid that does its important work, not in the printhead, but when it hits the substrate. And then it has to be fixed in place on the substrate so it can do what it needs to do during its life. That includes post-processing or actually in life as it is. So we're just part of a chain. We need data, we need signals, we need control, we need some physics, some mechanical push to pump the drops out with the right uniformity. And that needs a lot of collaboration. All the people on this panel, we all work together every day, every week. We're doing something together with OEMs, and whether it's with an OEM or whether it's actually developing something that's next. So collaboration is actually letting, for each of us and a great many others, to let each other know what we're up to and to try and involve each other in it, so that when the solution comes to the OEM to choose, they have a menu of things that all fit together and overlaps possibly, but no gaps.
Okay, so a lot of it's about covering potential for gaps between individual suppliers.
Yeah, inability to fit together. So there are some notable examples that you could have a printhead that's fantastic, but it doesn't work with the inks that the customer wants to use or needs to use. And the inks aren't ready for the substrate or that must be used in the end application, or it can't be dry. Like, for example, the low migration thing on UV, it's not just the ink, it's actually the way it's cured as well. So there are various things that need to fit together that cross the boundaries of individual organizations' responsibilities.
Okay. And you've mentioned ink a few times, so I guess that's an opportunity for Phil to chime in and give comment on collaboration and the importance, and maybe some examples of where it benefits.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Richard mentioned the delivery method being quite in a chain and linear, but we live in a sort of evolving ecosystem together, really. I mean, everything is getting better, faster, the software, the drive electronics, the inks. Independently developing something alone makes no sense at all. As the whole industry is it's continually evolving, continually improving. So we need to collaborate and make sure we're aligned within that. We don't need to make inks that cure at 1,000,000 miles an hour when there isn't delivery methods or curing methods to achieve that. It just makes no sense. So it's about making sure that the development is aligned to meet the existing and current needs, or even future needs, of what the printers are trying to achieve, while fully recognizing the space of the market they're trying to address with their solutions. So it is about working together and building these systems up. But also, I think for people to have expectation and sort of realistic view of what the inkjet needs to achieve, it is more complex than perhaps people first perceive. People that are completely alien to inkjet would probably recognize it only from being a desktop printer at home, where you buy it from the hardware store, you put in the cartridge and you press the print button and it works. And certainly Industrial Inkjet is not that. It is about having a lot more systems in balance to deliver a very much faster, more reliable, more industrial print solution. So it's about working within those constraints of what we can do individually with a vision to deliver the whole package together.
later we'll come back to talking about how we work together in the relationships to enable the ink models that will fuel the inkjet market going forward. But for now, it's an opportunity to mention that often people in presentations talk about the importance of printheads, substrate, and ink, and you can be left with the impression it stops there. But actually, to get some ink onto the substrate, you need a rather important part, don't you, Clive?
Well, sure. I mean, I would. I've always started these conversations saying the ink is the thing that the customer actually wants to get onto the paper, but actually, you've got to get that out, and that requires a printhead. Printhead needs some sort of waveform or data to send to it, and that's where the electronics comes in. And the actual inkjet, it's only a jet for a very short time, then it becomes drops. No one calls it industrial ink drop technology, but it is. And that breaking up actually happens outside the printhead itself. So whilst the printhead provides the flow, if you like, and it cuts it off at the right time and different pressures, the actual breaking up happens outside the inkjet printhead in the air. And so it's the design of that waveform, the design of the pressure system that provides the ink into the head is all very much part of that successful activity that goes on in the air between the head and the media itself. So optimizing that and getting a good collaboration, a good understanding, often a visualization actually of that happening is essential if you actually want inkjet to be an ink drop on media, which is actually what we're trying to do here. So yes, it's not just about getting the most expensive printhead or the best ink or something. It's actually far more complicated than that. And the ink supply system and the electronics you use, and even the way in which you play with the data is all very important in actually achieving the quantity of ink in the right place on your media that produces the effect that the customer is actually after in the first place. Otherwise, you're just trying to buy artifacts or reliability issues and you don't know where they come from. It isn't something that you can do on paper. You often have to do it by practice. And part of the collaboration we talk about here is actually trying to get some of that risk taken out before the customer comes in. So there's the timing issues, Richard alluded to just now, that you've got to have these products all available at the same time and mated correctly and matched in volume and availability. But there's also preparing or making sure they're capable of achieving what the customer wants to do before the customer tries to do it, and understanding where the limitation is on that, so the customer isn't trying to do something that just isn't physically possible. Because inkjet's an exciting area. It has, it is at the leading edge of many things, but the leading edge can also be bleeding edge. So there are going to be challenges where an OEM is trying to do something that's not been done before, or is trying to compete with something with an ink that's not been used before, or whatever, and is trying to do something a little bit new, a little bit different. And that's where we need trusting collaboration also to support that OEM after they've tried to do it and they're finding that a few bits don't work the way they hope.
Absolutely, and we'll come back to some application samples later, but some of them, like low migration capable inks, for example, are very reliant on that interaction in the system as a whole, which brings us nicely to you, Simon, to talk about the UV curing component. So for a lot of people misunderstand when things go wrong, that every part of the system has a role to play, and in UV curable systems, of course, the definition for curing it can be critical.
Yes, I like Phil's word of the use of the word balance. We all represent a particular area or a system within a larger subsystem, and it's almost like it has to be a well-conducted orchestra to bring them all together to work in balance. What we've been finding is that through the collaborations and the discussions I think what we do is we are educating each other more about our own individual needs and requirements for our systems to work in the best way. And for us in the inkjet area, we're finding that customers are becoming a lot more educated about the relationships between power, intensity, dose, in the optimal curing of the ink or coating and varnish. We obviously have to be very careful about how our system interferes with others. So things like electrical interference can be quite, the inkjets are quite sensitive to any electrical interference because of the proximity of our heads, our pinning heads, particularly to the inkjet. Stray light is a big issue for us, and we're constantly redesigning the front faces of our UV heads because of the sensitivity to the inkjet to any stray light, particularly for inks that UV curable inks that cure very quickly. We can, if we're not careful, we can block inkjets before the inks even manage to get out of the head. So I think, these forums are excellent in constantly having the discussion about what that balance is and how we can work together to make sure that each part of that subsystem is working in its ideal environment.
Yeah, so we have an ideal here that we can work together, and then the result comes out perfect. But there are some real challenges, aren't there? And in particular, the difficulty in the discussion we have today even is that one of disclosure. So do anyone have any other suggestions on where the main challenges lie with successfully collaborating to help our customers?
Well, I think you were alluding to the need for NDAs and the like. The NDAs, the relationship can be very helpful if there is a mutual NDA. But in this case, it's really quite helpful if multiple suppliers can be included. We want to be able to share what we've seen with the printhead manufacturer, for example. Very often, the closest relationship is often for Meteor between us and the printhead manufacturer. Yeah. We want to be able to say, look, we're seeing these issues, or we think they're going to want to do this in the future. How can we, collaborate on this and make sure it happens correctly? So, signing up NDAs, which are, mutual and stuff, does help. And I have 2 sister companies and 1 other affiliated company, and just getting a 4-way NDA agreed with my own group is hard enough to get all the workflow software and ripping software and all those kind of components signed up. But it is something that is necessary. And in the end, an NDA is only a piece of paper. It also comes down to trust. The point is that all the members on this group here, with the possible exception of you, Mark, I would say, we're very much mutually, connected to the success, the long-term success, the final success of the product in the market. The getting there is a challenge, and we have some revenue hopes perhaps in the getting there process, selling tools for investigation or development or so on.
Yep.
But ultimately, we're all actually hoping that this works. None of us hopes that the UV lamp isn't working or that the software is wrong. And trying to get that idea of trust going between the suppliers is a really important part of getting collaboration going, I think, so that we can help each other to make those bits work for the customer. Certainly, it's the case I know for Meteor that we want to see that customer get to market much more than we want to see them struggle. And it's the same for the printhead vendors, same for the ink manufacturers, same for every component supplier, actually. We want to see success, and that does mean actually we want each component to work. None of us want them to fail. So an NDA helps put that in place, some trust helps put that in place. Richard mentioned the idea of existing friendships more than actual brand names, but they're all very helpful and at moving this forward so that the proper communication can happen and the OEM issues can be dealt with as quick as they come, preferably before they come. We can spot them and say, there's going to be an issue here.
Yeah, so a lot of that comes actually from, you mentioned how we've known each other quite a while. It comes from that trust, it comes from that relationship that's as much personal as it is corporate. And the NDA is an expression of how to control the corporate risk of IP. But actually, in my work, it comes. I know a little bit of everything about each of your products, and it's about helping the customer with that information without revealing it in a way that upsets things like NDAs. And sometimes that can be challenging, in my view. But I think you're right to say they're a tool in terms of sharing information in a formal basis as much as they are a hindrance, potentially. So have we any other comments from panelists on NDAs?
I think that's an interesting point. I'm sort of, Clive, you've got your difficulties between your organisations. Imagine how difficult it is in RICO. So the bigger the organisation, and this applies to our customers as well as ourselves, the bigger the organisation, the more difficult it can be to just get over these initial hurdles. Arguing about the terms or the scope of an NDA, whether it's too wide, whether it's too narrow, whether we can say this, whether we can say that, whether it's the arbitration is under a system of English law or another law, whether the jurisdiction are in the English courts, how many lawyers need to be involved. Sometimes those can take weeks and months, and it would be better if we could just trust each other, which we can, but we need to back that up with paperwork. Often, the scope of an NDA is sort of irrelevant. You put it in the cupboard, forget about it. I've never had a dispute on NDA, because if you do cross one of those boundaries and you do reveal something you shouldn't, then I don't think it's a small enough industry for everybody to know about it.
I think that's true.
And it wouldn't work for the future. And we all have long-standing involvement in this industry, and there has to be trust. So I think NDAs are a barrier. They're not a facilitator. And often the NDA is because somebody feels that what they're developing is precious. But from my perspective, from my experience, often I see several developing the same thing, all in secret, and there's no differentiation. But everybody wants to keep it secret.
Yeah, most of the secrecy comes at the OEM level, or the people building the solutions. I think between ourselves as suppliers to the industry, we're a bit more collaborative behind the scenes, certainly from an R&D perspective, or a new product evolution perspective. The thing that constrains us from talking to each other is when it comes together in a customer solution where they want to sort of keep the secrecy and then stop the cross-learning, which would actually benefit ultimately the solution. If we could talk to ourselves with an opportunity or with the project in mind, I think the development of that project would be certainly faster and sort of quicker to market, perhaps.
And more reliable, perhaps, at times as well, Phil.
For sure.
Yeah.
For us as well, I mean, I agree with everything that everybody said. I mean, ultimately, I like to think I've got a level of personal and professional integrity that means I would never need to actually get any of those NDAs out of the cupboard either. I think some of the challenges for us are also commercial. If a collaboration with a company that knows more about a particular topic than we do is great from a technical perspective and really can help us advance our product development in the right direction and probably accelerate that development. Where the commercial challenges then come later on is in levels of exclusivity between those companies. And that, for a small company or smallish company like us, an SME like us, that provides a challenge in obviously commercializing the revenue behind that development. If we perhaps maybe are pegged in certain exclusivity deals with a larger OEM, a period of exclusivity from a collaboration like that over 2 years is likely to limit our revenue generation from other customers and other markets.
It's an interesting point, actually. So exclusivity, but I don't suppose it's only small companies that can suffer from people seeking exclusivity for bits of technology. What do you say to that, Phil?
I think everyone likes to have some exclusivity on things, but in reality, it is an open market. It's the same print heads and very similar inks and very similar software. It's a lot of the the skill comes from the OEM level in assembling all these components to make them different, and make them personalized for their customer needs and with their own branding, and put their stamp on it and their level of expertise, where appropriate, to raise it above the level of what their potential customers are doing. So while everyone would like exclusivity, the reality is there's a lot of commonality between the solutions and the components of the technology that are available, and it's the choice of and the assemblance of those, and what makes them sort of personal to the OEM, really, and makes them sort of stand out above the crowd. So there's a level of expertise from their side as well in order to deliver that solution. So it's a hindrance some ways. Certainly having a market exclusivity for inks, for example, is not something we'd offer, because we'd kind of constrain it by so much. And the other side to that, of course, is every machine is different. The combination and permutations of hardware, architecture, software make them quite unique. So realistically, you need a different ink for machine A versus machine B. So exclusivity is somewhat limited by the fact that all the machines are somewhat different.
Okay, that's a good point. Any comments on that one, Clive?
I don't think we have many exclusivities, and each machine tends to be very different. I mean, my challenge is a bit more perhaps in the software side, where people want an exclusive front end of some kind. But as long as they define what it is that they want, that's not such a challenge. It's you make an exclusive front end for them, but then why would you want a front end that looks like your competitors? So that hasn't been such a challenge in that area. So I think it's important to keep the OEM's business ambitions secret and enable them to get the return on their investment. And I think we all appreciate that. And that's what the NDA backs them up on paper, and we all understand it anyway. You can't hope to take the first mover's advantage and give it to everybody else and expect them to be happy. You work through their challenges. If a second mover wants to come into the market, there is often a difference anyway. So they're not going to be exactly the same, as Phil said. There's going to be something different about it. So there isn't such an issue there.
Thanks for those comments. I think for the next section, what we're going to do is going to move on to discussing some examples, really. And first, we're going to look a bit more strategically and consider the influence of collaboration on new product introduction, and specifically if a new printhead comes out or is emerging, how is that dealt with different parties having an interest in how well customers can adopt that printhead or ink. So, Richard, I guess because you're working for a company that sells printheads, it kind of puts you at the forefront of, describing what the process is and what you think it should be.
Of course, I'd have to say, if I'm on message, that the process as it is exactly as it should be. But then I wouldn't be entirely honest. I think the frequency of new printhead launch is actually not something where every quarter we've got a different collection. For example.
It's not like iPhones, right?
No, it's not. No, definitely not like that. Even though the iPhone's probably got far more complexity inside it. But it's a mass market, so it's done in a very organised process because it's repeated and refined. A printhead is the fruit of a lot of research, which is uncertain in its nature. So we're always trying to do something different, more, use different materials. There's so many differences. So there's a lot of background to a product launch, and sometimes there's also a lot of pressure to get launch out at a particular time. That means that some things get left behind and some things are done so they're not ready when the printhead itself might be ready, typically. And that's not just with Ricoh, I think that's common to all. Now, some printhead manufacturers do their own system components to enable a launch. It's better to actually work with the, let's call it production viable componentry, so software, hardware from the key people who are already there, the ones that might be chosen in the end, the ones that are cost viable, the ones that have the volume, the ones that have the R&D behind them in those areas, rather than to come up with something that's a kind of developer kit. So what it relies on is for us to, prior to launch, share anything that we can that is relevant to the parties in this panel, for example. So whether it's drive electronics, whether it's ink compatibility, or whether it's the applications and speeds that are anticipated with the printhead, we have to share those details. And behind the scenes, there is an awful lot of that sharing goes on. Now, sometimes the development happens in a certain way that there are not sufficient details to be able to do it all at once in parallel. So sometimes things have to take their natural course. It's all part of us delivering something to market that people can use. So with the inkjet community and the critical component suppliers, we certainly try to share what we're up to, share the direction of travel, point out the things that are coming, what sort of differences they might cause, and whether that's Gen 5 to Gen 6 with high speeds, different voltages, or if it's thin film or whatever it is, there are conversations going on in the background so that the aim of course, is always to deliver the whole thing at one time so that somebody can do something useful with what we're creating.
Yeah, so one part of that, you mentioned the fluid properties, one part of that is ink approvals, right? So Ricoh has a list of inks that are approved for heads that they offer. So that's a mechanism by which, in a new product introduction sense, you can work on as soon as you have a head ready in a final form, right?
Well, before a head's developed, then we're kind of sort of thinking that it's going to be suitable for this and that and the other type of application, because generally you have to have an idea of what you're designing for. So, for example, if it's a high-speed head, you might be on the high-speed single-pass web type of application. It could be a flexible packaging. It could be a corrugator. You're going to know the type of fluids or fluid properties that people are looking for. The kind of challenges, like, for example, on an impervious substrate with an ink, it's got to dry quickly. So you want fast drying. So open time on nozzles is key. So we generally should collaborate with the chemistry experts to see how the balances are between creating the in-application properties and the jetting properties are coordinated. That's in the ideal scenario. We know our next print heads, which applications they're targeted towards. Traditionally, we wait for our OEMs to sort of choose their ink vendors, and then they actually say, oh, we're working with these ink companies. Can you actually go through the approvals process for these new chemistries, new fluids? That automatically creates a delay. So what we're actually trying to do now is we're trying to proactively do some of this work, working with fluid producers themselves, formulators, so that when something comes to market, there is work already done, inks already tested, approved, snags solved, that type of thing. And that's not instead of, that's as well as. So if later an OEM comes to the table and wants to use a particular fluid, then we can react to that. But there's a certain amount of predictability to all of this as to which ink companies would be involved in particular applications.
Yeah.
Not exclusive, but it's kind of, you can predict. So we work with the partners that we think are going to be the long-term viable in those applications.
I guess where it concerns the boards, that's a bit more predictable because they're a smaller choice of independent supplier of electronics compared to an independent supplier of inks.
Yeah, and there's some with levels of sophistication as well, because it's easy to just sort of, a single head drive is one thing, but if it's actually on a single pass system with 250 or 600 heads in it, then that's something completely different. So somebody with the capability for a particular sector is essential. And the software part, as you mentioned, Clive, that's a key part, because of just sending signals, that's one thing. But if you've got the understanding of the data flow that's going to create the drops and the dots, then that's also essential.
So does that work the other way around as well, Phil? If you think this is going to be the next greatest ink, how do you make sure that the head manufacturers know what's coming?
It kind of works both ways in that respect. I mean, it's nice to collaborate in the pre-launch phase of a print head so they can sort of assess the kind of materials that would be suitable for the application. But I guess one thing we have a bit more luxury of is we're a bit more dynamic in that we can modify those formulations on the fly as going forwards, whereas printheads are quite punctuated in their timelines. And solutions evolve. They're not just, they're not just simply assembled. You don't give them the best ink, the latest printhead, put it all together, and it works. The idea is as well that there's a learning curve to assembling all this. We do things in the laboratory, as do the printhead guys, as do the software guys. It's often confined to one head wide, just to see what can happen in this theoretical experiment. As you all know here, once you assemble these heads together, it's 1.5 meters wide and it's going at several hundred meters a minute. There's a whole new level of physics and chemistry going on that we can't really emulate sometimes, and the software to drive all of that, etc. Only then it comes together. So from the ink perspective, because we have a bit more sort of tunability, we don't often start with what we'd call the high performance ink, while people are learning to handle their ink systems, align print heads, work out what their maintenance schedules are. They don't want an ink that is capable of drying, on a water-based perspective, at least at several hundred meters a minute, because they'd be not really printing very much and causing themselves more hassle trying to maintain heads they're not actually printing with at the moment, while they're engineering and fine-tuning everything else around the print system.
Yeah.
So it sometimes works to give an ink that is more user-friendly to start with, more able to work within the ink system, and then as they work out how to get faster, wider, has the software and the waveforms are there to support it, and you iron out some of the other deficiencies, you then creep up ink performance to maintain the properties you need at that time. Just to simplify the development process really, and make sure that you don't spend time mucking around and cleaning print heads frantically every 2 minutes, every time you stop and start, etc. So it's a case of working within the
I can concur with that.
As they evolve.
So having worked with customers who have maybe changed onto a more experimental ink a bit too quickly, I can definitely see where you're coming from. One of my bugbears typically is that when you have information on printhead performances, it's a test fluid without any particles in it. And it's sometimes difficult to get the customer to accept why their drops don't look quite so pretty when you put a real ink inside. So managing
it's irrelevant data.
Well, not irrelevant, because it tells you what drop size you should be expecting, but it certainly when it comes to aspects of reliability and especially at speed with airflow, just adding a pigment into a solvent can have a massive effect. And so it's good to hear that you guys are thinking about those challenges early on and how to manage them for the benefit of the customer. So Clive, where electronics is concerned, we've heard how printheads are a bit more discreet in terms of their development cycles, but that doesn't mean sometimes they don't come quite thick and fast, particularly with multiple suppliers making launches. How do you deal with that challenge?
Yes, well, we've got Rico here as one of the most prolific head developers in the world at the moment.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
Shucks.
it is.
Very apologetic.
It is a challenge to keep up. It is a case of the thing is it is essential, really. Actually, printhead manufacturers who produce printheads for their own printers, if they're a brand new printer manufacturer as well, that's fine. They can run their own internal timescales and worry if one's late or early, but if they actually want to get their heads used in the industrial market by leading OEMs other than their own, other than themselves, and most of the industrial market aren't companies that make their own printheads, then they need to get those heads, accepted and evaluated. And as Phil said, actually, you need to build a full machine. You need to get at least a part of a full machine to get a feeling for reliability in that new application. And actually, as Phil hinted, you need to work with the inks anyway through that process to get the results. So just saying, here is a head and here's a bit of stuff that you can put in a lab is a very slow starting point. And it's far better for the head manufacturer to be able to say, here is a head and here is a kit which will plug into your existing software, ideally. If it won't do that, then, well, here is a kit that will that you can test with a software that mimics roughly what you're doing, and all of the electronics to it. And so I would say most of the printhead vendors, and Rico's an example of one, now produce some kind of development kit with production-ready components in. And you can put together a 20-head or a 50-head system, the same month in which the head is released to the market. Now, okay, the inks, as Phil said, may take quite a bit of improvement. Maybe the software does too, but you can be printing very, very quickly now with a new head because of pre-launch collaboration between the different organizations you see here. That we'll work together to try and bring the different things you need to a point where you can now you don't have to go to a lab. Basically, you can go to a first prototype.
Okay.
It may not be the one you launch, but it's the first prototype, and it might be depending on the maturity required for your application as an OEM. And so that makes it much more viable to make a new product like a new printhead and take it to a new market, because you haven't got that 2-year time period in which there's a lot of doubt as to whether it's reliable, because they've never actually built something. It's a catch-22 basically initially when you bring out a new product, because no one knows it's reliable because you haven't built something, but you won't build it because you don't know it's reliable.
Yeah.
So you can cut through that much more quickly now with development kit components that allow you to do either something you can take to market yourself, or at least something that is identical to what you would take to market, and then you've got the final edges to do, the final, looking at the bugs of getting rid of those, looking at the inks and improving those, fixing the cure. You can get over that first point to testing a real application a lot quicker.
And I guess, Simon, you have experience of trying to insert curing into lots of different types of production, not all of it inkjet, but with the focus of today's discussion. Do you see the benefit of collaboration there when you're trying to introduce new products specifically for print, an inkjet print?
Yes, I think it'd be easier for me to say that, we just do what we're told to do. I'm not a UV expert by any means, but it seems that, we can provide a level of intensity for a period of time. And we also have to which means that we can provide a particular wavelength and a particular power for a particular period of time. Of course, we need to collaborate with the ink and varnish coating developers in terms of what that requirement is, in terms of the best level of dose, at the level of intensity for the curing. And we need to make sure that we protect the inkjet as best we can, as I mentioned before, from any electrical interference or any particular, the stray light particularly. From our product development, we have to make sure that we are on top of the LED chip development, which moves at quite a pace. Particularly now we're looking at the UVC LED chip development, which with the virus we've had for the last 6 months has now started, with necessity being the mother of invention. The developments in the UVC LED chips have accelerated, but we have to stay on top of that chip development. So we're constantly having to develop our drive systems, but also our cooling systems in order to run the LED chips at their optimum efficiency, so that we can get the best life cycle and durability and performance out of the LEDs. We believe that for integration technology, one of the USPs that we have is that we've built a series of building blocks, and we can put those building blocks together to cater for many different applications without having to redesign the wheel each time. And we also are very good at tailoring our standard product to a particular application. I mean, that might even be just as simple as the fact that from an integration into a machine, it's easier for the cable to come out the side than it is to come out of the top. Simple things like that, whereby we have future-proofing is maybe a bit strong, but we have taken into consideration different configurations of our standard product to help the integrators with the machine. Because of the volumes that we make our product in, we are more than happy to consider the, not bespoke, but tailoring of standard product to meet the application as best we can.
I think we heard mentioned earlier pinning as a tool for single pass printing using UV, and when manufacturers introduced pinning lamps, there is some learning there in terms of air handling and all those sorts of things that did require communication and collaboration between machine builders, ink suppliers, because if you have air cooling and you have ink mist, that isn't always a good combination. So I think some of us around the panel have been there and seen the ramifications of that. So design of the curing system is just as important as design of other parts of the print system.
Yes, and actually, it's very easy for us to issue an operating manual that says our equipment will work in this ambient temperature and this, in this particular area, and the airflow requirement is this. But of course, that's not the case. It's not the case. One size fits all doesn't work, and so it's very important for us to understand that the extremes of the potential operating environment. We put 45 degrees ambient on our operating manual as a sort of a standard maximum. But if you're running a print shop in Mexico with no air conditioning, then we often run into issues with the air handling. If we know about those requirements up front, we might suggest a different product. As Richard was saying, earlier on, I think even before we started recording, if your product isn't right, then maybe sometimes you have to suggest to the customer that maybe your product isn't the right one for their application.
Yeah, and that's a responsible thing to do, not just for them, but also for your business too. Otherwise, you'll end up trying to fight fires that are quite unnecessary.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Trying to, it's easy for the sales guy to make the sale and then move on, but it's actually the mess that comes later if you're struggling with an installation or even just continued operation of the unit in a production environment.
Thanks for those views. I think from a new product introduction, we've got a nice coverage there. I think there's a little bit of time left, and what I thought would be useful is to maybe pick up some examples of where collaboration has been of practical benefit. And from my experiential perspective, when I started out at Sun & Chemical many years ago, I was working on labels. And now label is probably the most common inkjet implementation of industrial, other than the commercial print, of course, that Rico has a division specializing in, other than the famed ceramics example. So labels have become quite a big thing, but a lot of that was to do with identifying the correct print heads to get the reliability to where you need to be for continuous printing, as well as understanding the difficulties of the substrate and then the choice of the ink. Again, that was UV. So that meant putting on curing systems like yours, Simon. So in my experience, that collaborative effort in order to get the OEM to where they want to be is a massive overlap of effort between suppliers, but includes everyone, because it's the ultimate aim is that print quality output that can match either the flexo, the high resolution flexo, or the electric photography that's being held up as a benchmark at the time. And so my personal experience was that was quite a long road, and that involved for different OEMs quite a lot of collaboration. Has anyone got any experience or comments on that with that market in question?
That's a very, very good example, I think, Mark. I mean, from a high level, looking down at a label machine over 10 years, they fundamentally look the same. Yet the output coming out of them has improved dramatically from trade show to trade show, year on year, even if they seem to be using the same print heads. But the evolution of that technology and collaboration, albeit somewhat orchestrated by the OEM themselves, but I think all parties here have been instrumental in driving that image quality forwards, whether it's faster, whether it's smaller drops, whether it's higher frequency jetting, whether it's thinner ink films, whether it's curing it better, less mist, and pinning, and then the whole thing comes together so that fundamentally the machines look almost the same, but the quality improvements never really stopped. And they are getting to the point now where they are very good quality, very thin UV ink films looking comparative to flexo print. So, in fact, in our booth at Label Expo, when we were allowed to have one last year, we had a flexo printed label and a one done on an inkjet machine on our booth, and we're challenging people to sort of spot the difference and choose which one was which. And it was very mixed. I mean, people couldn't really tell, to be honest. They were very, very, very compelling. It's a good testament as a case study to say that inkjet has got to a point through evolution, through collaborations, to get to the point that it is more than market ready and is selling well.
That's a really interesting thing, Phil, because if you have to look through a loop and judge whether it's different or the same and which one's which, then maybe it's fit for purpose. So it brings into the topic of print snobbery, and all of us, I've just noticed on this panel, all of us wear glasses and we all look at tiny dots to try and get that microscopic inspection of what's produced via our systems. But when it comes down to it, we're all consumers as well. So in packaging and label, we've all been party to those arguments. Oh, it's not as good as this, or it's not as good as that, and it needs to be improved this way and that way, and gamut's not as wide. Actually, what we do is, between us, fit for purpose. It's good. It's fit for purpose. And often we have to jump through some extra hoops because our technology is different. And we all face the same struggle there, trying to convince people that there aren't those barriers and there aren't those illusory reasons why people shouldn't make the jump from one to the other. Label was a very big struggle a few years ago. I remembered back, I hadn't thought of that for a while, Mark, but those times of actually trying to overcome the obstacles in those cases. But that's way in the past now, and it's just an accepted solution. That's the way we should be aiming for these things. And the collaboration that goes on the background, whether it's the background or reactive in the open to a certain situation, it has to go on for those things to be overcome, for what seemed like cutting edge to become standard. So we can move on to the next.
And one of the things that's perhaps led the market to is have greater confidence for moving into packaging on the basis of the success of labels. But as we discussed earlier, for those markets, the inks change. So you're going from a majority UV curable on film and paper to exclusively film, and almost certainly, with a couple of exceptions, aqueous inks. So again, that introduces those new product introduction challenges that we referred to already as we evolve the label learning into packaging.
If I may throw in, sorry, a little bit, I hope this doesn't come across as cheeky, but there's another area of collaboration which has been very important in labels and packaging, which relates to my company Meteor, and that's been the collaboration with screening and ripping. And the screening transformations have made the imaging in packaging so much better in the last 5 years, let's say. Certainly the Label Expo now, the changes in screening that have been developed for grayscale inkjet have really come through, and the collaboration between the screening and the workflow and the data path that Meteor provides has been an essential one too, to get the screening done quickly and to have it done to produce the print quality that is needed. One final plug is, of course, in the last few years also, there's been a big development, and again, this is a collaboration very often, but with imaging to tell whether or not the result is there. Yeah. And we can now fix a missing nozzle in the way in which we alter the data, so we don't rely upon that nozzle being operable in the first place. We divert data that would have gone to that nozzle and don't send it anymore because nothing wouldn't work if it got there, and we adjust the image to allow for the fact that it doesn't have that nozzle anymore. Really has helped. So there's collaboration outside of these 5 companies as well. A few other areas I was just pointing out have all come in to make the success of label and packaging.
And I can identify both areas. I recall telling OEMs that I think it's where you put the jobs that matter, not just what they're made of. And it does come down to the screening. And when you talk about the imaging, it was in 2008 I first tried to get someone to give me a scanner that could find missing nozzles on a 1 meter wide printer, and it didn't exist. And it was a lot of money to get someone to develop one. more money than the printer really justified. So it's nice to see those technology factors becoming an enabling thing to these industrial inkjet solutions in a platform like labels, but also in more niche applications. And structured printing and printer shape have all benefited from these types of innovations. Stitching print heads on a conical shape is not that easy, is it?
We did that recently, though, but yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I think actually we're coming towards the end of our discussion. So from a wrap-up perspective, I think there's one more thing I just want to discuss, and waveforms is something that I spend a lot of my time doing, and really it is still a collaborative effort in some sense, because you've got a fluid that might require a different waveform, you've got a head architecture that may support it, and software in order to make it possible, as well as Clive, the drop module that you sell, which I have in our laboratory, to make waveforms. How important is it to have that customizable factor when it comes to getting the best out of inkjet projects?
Every printhead needs a waveform of some kind, and the standard waveform with the standard ink, we will get you something. I remember trying to get a new printer to work down in Turkey a couple of years ago, and we were getting very, very faint prints, no matter how much voltage and whatever we did to the thing. And eventually we discovered they just loaded the wrong waveform, put the right one in, and suddenly the thing was flooded with ink. So, I mean, but that's kind of the extreme, As to optimization, yes, you need to get optimized. No process, no ambient system. Someone mentioned a maximum for ambient temperature in his speaking just now. But, ambient will change, ink performance will change, the filtration will be different, the pumps will be different. If you're not at optimum, then you can easily be nudged to suboptimum. If you're not in the middle of optimum. So actually optimizing the waveform for an ink in its rough center of its performance of temperature and pressure and everything else is essential for reliability, because you don't want it to work just one day. You want it to work throughout the summer and the winter. You want it to work when things are old and when things are brand new. So optimizing the waveform, I would say, is an important part of the of getting a reliable inkjet product.
I think my point was that delivering that as a possibility is an important output of collaboration between parties here, because if an ink manufacturer said, "Oh, we need a waveform for your ink," there's a who does that kind of question, and then making the tools available either through the hardware or through the software functionality.
Totally agree, Mark. I mean, it's a weird one, because it's not completely clear whose responsibility it is to provide. And ultimately, almost all parties here can. And people do reference and ask for, do you have a waveform and ink for this head or this application, etc.? And the answer is, we've got a starting waveform, but it probably won't deliver what you need. You need a fine-tuned waveform depending on your ink system and the speed you're running, etc., etc. So again, it becomes a collaborative effort. I mean, but what's the answer? I don't know. Do you go for an independent? Do you ask the ink guys? Do you ask the printhead guys? Is it the software guys? For me, in this Venn diagram of responsibility, the waveform sits almost perfectly in the middle, and everyone's got a handle to turn. But I don't know who ultimately is supposed to be doing it. And I think it varies by application and by who the OEM is and what we're trying to do. But it's a tool that we all have. But certainly, we're chemists. We're not engineers. We can do some of it. We can make it jet one head in our lab and get you going. But certainly from our perspective as Sun Chemical, it'd be ideal for someone who's more expert in waveform development to come in and take that over and really get it fine-tuned for the application, whoever it is that person. I'm not sure.
Sounds like a good topic for a future discussion. So, well, I think we're about out of time now, so I'd just like to thank you all for your input and openness in talking about the value of collaboration. And as we've demonstrated here, parties collaborating together to give some useful information for our industrial session from FuturePrint. So thanks again to all the guests, and look forward to talking to you soon for other reasons.